So it's a beautiful setting to have the conversation we're about to have. We're going to focus all throughout 2023 on exploration. The exploration of the mind, the exploration of physical space, the art of the possible. And I happened to be reading a book not that long ago that I'm going to recommend later in the hour. And this gentleman started talking about exploration and mankind's passion to explore. And I said, that's what we as a university should be focusing on. So we've asked this gentleman if he would join us today. I'm going to introduce him properly in a moment. But know that he doesn't need to be here today. He's been doing this for 60 years. The idea of whether it was at the White House or whether it was in Paris or whether it was behind the Iron Curtain in Moscow in 1972, whether it was every major medal, award, trophy that can be given to first a United States citizen and then an Air Force graduate, this gentleman has already received. Ticker tape parades in Chicago, down the streets of New York City. So I humbly asked him if he would consider accepting this award today, and he's done us a great service by doing that. When this conversation ends, and in a minute we're going to sit down and talk, we're going to go next door to the Swisher Theater. And if you're going to go, I'm happy for you because I saw the movie yesterday, and it is a remarkable, once-in-a-lifetime experience to see from the point of view of the astronaut himself what it's like to train and then lift off and then land on the moon. You will be holding your breath when he's about to land on the moon. I've seen it. You can't help but do that. But the movie is archival footage. The genius of the movie that he's put together is that it's for education purposes. There's no talking head here 52 years later recasting what might have been considered. It's all contemporaneous. So if you have 45 minutes, I strongly recommend you go next door. Now let me do my official introduction of a great friend of this university, graduate of West Point Military Academy, fifth in his class of 633 in 1954. 2 master's degrees from MIT in 1962, both in aeronautics and astronautics. A colonel in the United States Air Force with over 5,600 hours of flying time. Director of NASA's Dryden Flight Research Center, from which he retired in 1977. His time in outer space totals 23 days. His time outside of any vehicle, what they call an EVA, which I'll ask him about, is 21 hours. He was the co-pilot of Gemini VIII with Neil Armstrong, just the 2 of them. He was the command module pilot of Apollo 9 with Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweickart. And then with Jim Irwin and Al Worden, he was the commander of Apollo 15, the most advanced, sophisticated, and substantial scientific undertaking ever done up to that point by NASA. He has received the NASA Exceptional Service Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Force Distinguished Medal 3 times, the NASA Distinguished Service Medal twice. He was the first ever American citizen to receive the United Nations Peace Medal, which was bestowed upon him at the United Nations by Secretary General U Thant. The David Schilling Trophy from the Air Force Association, its top honor. The Robert Collier Trophy for greatest achievement in astronautics and aeronautics. He has an honorary doctor of astronautical science from the University of Michigan. I'm proud to say he has an honorary doctorate in science and technology from Jacksonville University. He is a member of the International Science Hall of Fame in New Mexico, and he's in the United States Astronaut Hall of Fame in 1993, the ultimate lifelong learner who believes in engineering and the sciences and culture. Our 2023 Jacksonville University Presidential Global Citizen Award awardee. Please join me in welcoming forward Colonel David R. Scott. So thank you all. That was the number when I played, but 15 has a little significance to you. So for the next 30 or 40 minutes, we're just going to have a conversation, so everybody relax. This is a rare opportunity to talk to someone who's been on 2 planets. The only living person out of 8 billion of us in the world who was a commander of an Apollo mission. So David, if you'll let me ask you one personal question, and then we'll go right into it. Kid born in San Antonio, Texas, how did you get into flying?
Well, my dad was a fighter pilot, and when I was 4 years old, I decided I wanted to fly. So I just followed that trail and followed my father, who was just a great guy. He started with nothing, supporting his mother and putting himself through college. Did pretty well, followed him along, took his advice, and then I got the breaks. So as we went along in my course, in his guidance, you know, I took various paths, as we all take paths, and I ended up at the right place at the right time. And I was very fortunate because I had a lot of people help me, especially teachers. And I'll give you more on that if you want.
Oh, go right ahead.
You know, first, I'm very honored to receive this award from JU. This is a great school. It may not be a big school, but it's a great school. And I encourage everybody to continue to support it because Tim is really building a fine institution with fine teachers and fine students, and we need to do that. And in fact, I was an engineer and a pilot, and I got into NASA, and I got assigned to a really great mission, Apollo 15, but its focus was on field geology. And I was an engineer and a pilot. What a rock, you see a rock, see one rock, see every rock, right? No big deal. Why is it a big deal about this? And then I got a teacher named Leon Silver from Caltech. And I got a training program that NASA put together, which was brilliant. And so I followed along, and pretty soon I got the bug in a totally new discipline. And I can assure you, geology is completely different from engineering. You can't draw a nice, clean diagram, you know, and you can't put a process through like a math or algebra process. You have to think your way through it, and you have to think in a new language. And Lee Silver taught me how to do that. And by the time I got to the moon, which was quite a bit later, I loved it. I couldn't wait to get out and go have a look at the rocks. Because, man, there's some really cool rocks out there. And it's nature, and it's beautiful. It's just amazing what's up there in terms of variety and complexity and enjoyment. It's part of nature. And so I discovered that, you know, explore a little bit. Tell your kids and your grandkids and your nieces and nephews, go explore a little bit. Jump into some other discipline. Find a great teacher. It's really, really rewarding. And I think JU is the place to do that. And I'm really honored to be part of this community. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, David. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So the last time we saw David was at the in a large setting was in San Diego at the San Diego Air and Space Museum, where they were honoring him in front of nearly 1,000 people, I think, all super experts in NASA and the moon. You have a different crowd today, a little more general, and you just took us from 1932 to 1971 with Apollo 15. I wonder if we can back up just a little bit. In 1958, President Eisenhower creates NASA. In 1961, think how fast this happened. In 1961, you know, a 43-year-old John Kennedy states that we're going to send man to the moon and bring him back safely. In 1962, you graduate MIT. And in 1963, you're named an astronaut, just like that. Can you help us understand a little bit when you went from flying Mach 2 at 100,000 feet in an F-104 to becoming an astronaut? How did that happen? How did you get pulled and named to be one of a dozen people in the world to come into Group 3 to become an astronaut?
Well, right place, right time, right circumstances, right teachers. And, you know, we all put our applications in, quite a long process, all took the physicals, went down to Houston and took mental exams and situations like that, even with a psychiatrist, and what do you think? And see this piece of paper? What's on it? Can't tell, it's upside down. So, or as Mike Collins said, it's a snowstorm. Anyway, so much for that. We went through all this testing and everything, and I guess I put my application in like all of my buddies. I was in the Aerospace Research Pilot School at the time, and I had a pretty good Air Force career in front of me. Lots of things were happening in the Air Force. The X-15, the dinosaur, the manned orbiting laboratory. I had a chance to stay at the school and teach, and et cetera, et cetera. But everybody put an application in for the astronaut program in my group. And I guess basically what happened when they threw all the applications down the stairs, mine had a paper clip on it, and I got to the bottom. That's about how it happened.
It makes you very hard to interview if you're going to be that damn humble, but I'll keep trying. Let's skip on ahead. If we can talk about Gemini VIII a little bit. So, folks, the picture now, you've gone from the Mercury, the original astronauts, the original 7, to you're going to Gemini. Then we're going to get to Apollo. There's so much to learn along the way. Gemini VIII, you're paired up with a then relatively unknown gentleman, Neil Armstrong, and the two of you go up. Can you remind us what it is you were trying to do, and then why this has become one of the most famous flights of any kind of all time because of the maneuvers you pulled to get yourselves out of a crisis?
Well, that was another good break for me. You never know, within the astronaut corps, you never know when you're going to be assigned to anything, and everybody's on the edge just to go fly. In those days, there weren't many people in space. And I got picked to go fly with Neil Armstrong. And I thought, wow, this is really cool. I knew Neil a little bit, but not much. In fact, my boss, Deke Slayton, got me in the back of the viewing room one day and said, "Hey, Dave, you got a minute?" And I was just a rookie. And I said, "Yes, sir, fine." He says, "I want you to work with Neil on Gemini VIII." I thought, huh? Gemini VIII? Neil? Oh, yes, sir, I'll be there. So I go over to the office, and there's Neil, cool, calm, always cool, calm. "Hi, Dave, come on in, sit down, let's go fly." I thought, man, this is cool. And I spent the next 6 months with Neil in a very intense program for Gemini VIII, which was going to be the first full spectrum of space flight. Rendezvous, docking, EVA, experiments, so-called long duration at the time, which was 4 days, And we lifted off on a Titan II ICBM. Back in those days, you could do that. And we did the first docking, second rendezvous, first docking. And to make a long, long story short, okay, we had a problem in a spacecraft we didn't know about, and we started into a tumble. We thought it was the Agena target vehicle, but it wasn't. Finally got to the point where we had to undock. We were at nighttime over the Pacific, no horizon, and no contact with the ground. And by the time we got contact with the ground, we were turning like almost 1 revolution a second. The thing had pretty much come unglued. There was only one thing left to do, and Neil did it. And he found the one switch way in the corner, because that was Neil Armstrong. And he got us out of a box, and we got down okay. And then we went through this sort of like, what'd you guys do? What'd you do? Well, we tried to get ourselves out of a problem. But the reward for me was not so much getting down and Neil saving my tail, was the fact that I got to fly with Neil. And we became close personal friends for the rest of our lives. Unfortunately, Neil passed away not too long ago, but he was just a wonderful guy. He's the only guy that I know of all the people we were working with who could have been first man on the moon. He's the only one who could have taken it from a disposition-wise. And he was just, and I'll pump up Neil, I'll tell you, that guy is just a brilliant person and such a nice guy. I mean, Maggie and I went to his 80th birthday party. It was just like old home week. And with everybody, he was that way. So if you look down the road and if you look at history, you see a lot of Neil Armstrong, but not many people really know who the Neil Armstrong really was. But he was one of the most outstanding people I have ever known, and always a good, good friend. So Gemini VIII gave me two things: rendezvous, docking, space flight and landing, but gave me a friendship with Neil Armstrong, for which I'll always be grateful.
It's wonderful. And if you're in, please. If you're interested, there is a tremendous movie. It came out in 2018. It's called First Man. It was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. Ryan Gosling plays Neil Armstrong, and Stephen Cullen plays Dave Scott. And there's quite a scene in that movie of what Dave just passed off as this little tumbling exercise. I think most people related to NASA thought you all were in within 5 to 10 seconds of first passing out and then dying. So it's a remarkable story. And you got into a little bit about coming in together. What was the cult? There's 2 kinds of culture I hope we can talk about, because we at the university talk all the time about culture eats strategy. We have all these wonderful strategies here, but if the culture of the university doesn't want to believe in excellence and service and humility and hard work, no strategy launched on the 3rd floor of this building is going to work. I learned a lot of that from this gentleman 15 years ago when we first met. Can you talk a little bit about what was the culture of the astronauts? Was it, jock culture, locker room competition? And then what was the culture of Apollo? Because those of us in business in the 80s and 90s kind of worshipped Apollo and everything that you were able to do. Can you talk a little bit about culture?
Well, yes, indeed. That was probably another fortunate experience for me, to fall into the NASA culture at the time, because everybody trusted everybody, everybody was honest, everybody spoke up, regardless of the subject. And there were great debates, but when a boss made a decision, everybody got in the boat and rowed the boat in the right direction, whatever the boss calls it. But we debated hard, and it was honest. And the competition within the astronaut car, there were 30 of us at the time. And early on, the word got out, you can't shine anybody's shoes and get anywhere in this outfit. You got to do the best you can all the time, but honestly. And I'll tell you, we competed hard in everything. And I could never beat Mike Collins in handball. I could never beat him. And I tried really hard, okay? But it was competition all the time. And then our boss at the time, Deke Slayton, who'd been one of the Mercury astronauts and got grounded, was the boss. And he called the shots, and he picked the crews, and nobody challenged him. And his philosophy was, anybody can do any job. So everybody in his mind was equal. But he did have another little secret. He got us together one day and got us in the big boardroom and said, okay, you guys, we're getting ready to fly now. And I'd like for you guys to put down on a little piece of paper the first crew to the moon. Who do you think amongst all of you will be the first crew to go to the moon? Only put 2 names down. We know you'll pick yourself. Which is true, right? And I think from that, Deke started pairing people up. We lost a lot of guys, unfortunately, in aircraft accidents and Apollo 1 fire, but there was always a backup crew, and Deke always rotated in. And as far as I know, every guy who flew did his job 100%. So the initial selection process and then the training was absolutely tremendous. We got trained in everything you can think of from, I just found some of my jungle survival stuff the other day in an old Foot Locker. Jungle survival, desert survival, water survival. I got helicopter qualified down at the Navy Pensacola. I mean, they taught us everything. It was just a marvelous training program. And when you got ready to go, all the competition went together and you were a team and a family. And it was just a great culture to live in. And I hope that we can spread that, other people can spread that, the university can spread that, because it's such a nice, comfortable way to work, to know that even though the person across you is going to try to beat you in whatever game it is, they'll play honest and truthful. And that was really a real boon to that period of time.
Great. We're going to talk about Apollo 15 here, but in the 80s and 90s, if you were in business, there were kind of two great Apollo stories that everybody in the Fortune 100 would tell. One was, if you had a big, audacious idea, it was called a Kennedy moonshot. Everybody used the same term, and every corporation I was ever in, a Kennedy moonshot was you were going to make a big, hairy, audacious comment and try to get everybody to go figure out how to do it. That's the first one. The second one was a story of supposedly some night at NASA, a group came upon a gentleman, a custodian, who was sweeping the floor off hours, and the group came up to him and said, "Sir, what are you doing?" And he said, "We're sending a man to the moon." And it's that second one that I've never quizzed you on where that at, but that idea that we in industry were trying to borrow from you in that world of the culture. So can we talk a little bit about Apollo 15 for a bit? Up until that point, Apollo had been on the moon, starting with Apollo 11 with Neil Armstrong, for a day. And now there was a different idea of something called a J mission. Can you explain to us what's a J mission and how did that change where we went with scientific research?
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting concept that doesn't show up very much. In fact, Mag and I were just talking more about it not too long ago. After the Apollo 1 fire, which was really tragic, we all know that, and everybody got through it, and we got through it very, very well. Lost three really good guys. In fact, my Apollo 9 crew and I were their backup until 2 months before the fire. So we know what the problems were, and there was no one person's fault. There was no one thing's fault. It's just very hard to go to the moon. To try to put all that stuff together and make it work with all those different companies with different cultures was a monumental task. It finally got smoothed out, and everybody got together, and it all worked. But part of 15 was the science part. And what's your main point again?
I'm trying to get it.
He's so much about this. He knows so much about this stuff that I have trouble just having lunch with him anymore.
I've read every book on you, and you've read every book on me, but that saved you a lot of reading, right? I was interested in the concept of a J mission being multiple days long, having geology and photography.
After the fire, NASA decided to organize the missions according to letters, A, B, C, D, F, G, even the unmanned missions in the beginning. And if any one mission didn't accomplish all of its objectives, it would be reflown again. Like on Apollo 9, which was Earth orbit checkout, was a D mission. We've gotten down to D. And if we didn't get everything done on Apollo 9, then Apollo 10 would fly the D mission again. So your position in line didn't tell you where you may be in terms of a lunar landing or even going to the moon. Because if things failed and problems, and this is all really complicated, old technical stuff. I mean, the computer was 36 words, right? One piece of paper, and that's all we had. So when things went smoothly, it was a jump. Quickly. So 9 was a D mission, and then the landing was a G mission. Neil's was G by the time we got to G, and Apollo 14 was H, and when they shifted everything around and came out with Apollo 15, they called it J, because they added a lot of things to the lunar module. They added a rover, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was down the line, E, F, G, H, I, J. There was never an I. You probably know why. A certain I company deserted during a certain war. So we don't have I companies anymore. So we got to J, and then we're going to K, and that was the end of the program. So Apollo 16 and 17 were also J missions. Same payload we had, different place on the moon, lots of new discoveries. And then, unfortunately, the program came to an end. But I'll give you a thought on that. The program was tired. We've been going full tilt. I mean, we launched, the big Saturn V, okay? We launched 5 of them in 7 months. I mean, they were pumping these things out because Wernher von Braun said, we're going to go hard, and did. But the time we got down to Apollo 17, people were tired, machinery was tired, parts were hard to get because companies had gone out of business. And, you have one little part in that big monster machine. If you can't find a replacement part, it didn't go. So by the time we got to 17, in my opinion, we were tired. Everybody was tired. All the mission control guys, they work every mission, on and on and on. And I think it was a wise decision to power down and then start up again. But then they started up with a shuttle. That's, another decision by more people. And then things have sort of dribbled along. Hopefully we'll get back to an Apollo concept someday and let this generation go out and play with the sand. It's fun, man.
So it's 1971, and you're the first human being to ever sit down and drive on the moon. I once asked David, I made a mistake. I used the word feel. I said, how did it feel? Astronauts don't care about feelings, I learned. I said, how did it feel to sit down and put a key in, turn the ignition, grab the steering wheel, and drive on the moon? And David, the engineer astronaut, said, you can tell, Tim, you have no idea what you're talking about. First of all, it can't be a key because the gloves, I said, that wasn't my point. My point, he's like, of course it was a switch. I said, okay, well, anyway, when you grab the wheel, well, Tim, it can't be a wheel. What do you ought to do? It has to be a stick. Like I said, that's not the point either, David. How did it feel? And he said, what do you mean? It started. We ran. So how did you prepare for the challenge of driving in 1/6 G? So you were a 180-pound man, but you weighed 30 on the moon. And at one point you picked it up and lifted it. And what was it? Can you, without using the word feel, can you help us share the experience of driving on the moon?
Well, it's physically and physiologically, it's really simple. It's easy to drive. It's like a 1/6 G go-kart, and you control it with a stick, a hand controller to make it go forward, back. Pilots can even do that, It's encouraging, right? But it was a marvelous machine. It was made very quickly. It was a hurry-up kind of mode, and they put, we call it single-string components on it, so little redundancy and all that. And they basically, based on a typical long-period development program of some big item of technology, they just blazed through it, put it on, and hoped it would work. And by golly, it worked, and it was really great. What it did for us was to enable us to go great distance for the science. Our mission was science, and the science was in various spots in about a 6-kilometer radius around the lunar module. And without the rover, we'd have never gotten there. But the rover was very flexible. It was easy to drive. It was easy to pick up and turn around if you got stuck. The base was so broad, unlikely it would ever turn over. The only problem could have had, was lose the navigation, which we call single string, little cheapy navigation stuff, which we did not lose, and other components of failure, which would have caused us to have to walk back. Now, this is one of those tricky little things. I got asked this question by the current group, right? So if I do a little engineering here, it's sort of pretty, these guys are so smart. All these people working for us, with us and all that, they're so innovative. So we had a backpack, and on top of the backpack, there was an oxygen bottle, a little pack, which was our emergency oxygen supply if the main part of the backpack failed. We never had a failure on a surface, interestingly enough, but we had an emergency supply of oxygen. And also, we had a buddy system, like scuba diving. So if one guy's backpack failed, you could tap into the other guy, and you could walk back from wherever you went in the rover. So the distance the rover went from the lunar module was based on walk-back capabilities. So we got out to 5 kilometers, and we were really quite comfortable. And there was one other failure. You can have two major failures out there. One's a backpack failure. One of the guys have a backpack failure. and the rover fails. So if the rover fails for some reason, you can walk back with both backpacks. If one of the backpacks fails for some reason, you can drive back on the rover. But then somebody asks the question, what if the backpack fails and the rover fails? You had a bad day.
Touche. Okay. So we're all picturing you out on the moon's surface in 1/6 G. I'm going to guess a compass wouldn't work. Maybe you can talk to us about compass. And was there ever a time when you and Irwin ever lost visual connection with your spacecraft? And if you did, like flying at night upside down, how did you know where to go?
Well, that's a good question, Tim, because it is an unusual question and discussion. I haven't heard it lately at all, okay? One of the interesting parts of the surface of the moon is it undulates. It's got dips in it. And when you look at all the pictures, it's all flat. It's not flat. There's not one level place on the lunar surface. They're either indentations, craters, boulders, or something. It's a very irregular surface. So sometimes you're in one of these little gullies. In fact, we had Gemini called one on the way out there, Irwin's Dunes, because it looked like we're going over dunes, right? It wasn't the kind of sand that you see here. It was firmer. But on the other hand, you get to a position where you cannot see the lunar module. And I explained this to Tim. It's an interesting trigonometry question for a classroom someday to learn about some of these things. They said, well, you've got mountains around you. Well, yes, we had mountains around it, but if you go directly away from a mountain and then you go laterally, okay, if you look back at the peak of the mountain, the lunar module isn't going to be there. It's going to be on the peak if you're directly out from the mountain. So you can't just head to a mountain. You have to have some compass heading. There's no magnetic field on a moon, or very little. And how do you find your way back? Well, way back in the early 1900s, somebody invented what they called a sun compass for the Arctic and the Antarctic, okay? In fact, we're trying to find out who invented that because we can't find out. It's really interesting. I got a good friend that's got a website on this thing. They took one of our big checklists, flat piece of cardboard, you turn it over, you mark a compass rose on it, and you turn a little flap up to get the sunshade, the shade where the point's like a sundial, right? And then you put around the side 360 degrees and where the limb is. So by using a sun compass, you can orient your direction to get back to the lunar module. Well, we never had to use it, but it would have worked. In fact, when we first landed, we didn't know where we were, and neither did mission control, okay? So in order to find out our location, I stuck my head out of the spacecraft and used the sun compass to triangulate our position. And then we were within several yards of that by using a sun compass. So this is just a point to make on innovation. All of these 400,000 people were thinking every day about Man Moon 1970. They're all thinking about how can I help, what can I contribute, how can I help things work better? And it's just amazing to see the response when something comes up and somebody says, we need a widget or a wadget or whatever. There'll be somebody in the back room somewhere who comes up with the answer. Again, back to the culture. Everybody rowed the boat in the same direction, and the innovation, in fact, we're putting together a Apollo 15 learning hub at Emory University with all the innovations on it that people came up with, most of which you'd never heard of, but in an emergency situation, they were there. And the sun compass was there, and it was really cool. I mean, it was fun to play with, too. Another benefit of all that, you get all these toys to play with, man. It's really good.
Speaking of toys to play with, can we talk a little bit? You are credited, and you'll see it in the movie, with finding the most substantial geologic discovery in the history of man, which has now been dubbed the Genesis Rock. And there's some discussion as to that made all of Apollo 15 and all of Apollo well worth doing. Can you help us understand what is the Genesis rock? What were you looking for? And how, as an engineer from MIT, did you know what you were looking at?
You have to declutch from MIT. I love it, but geology is a totally different world. So in the early formation of the moon, we know now, our leading theory is, of course, there'll always be some dissenting scientists, and that's good. So the leading theory now is that Earth, early, a little over 4.5 billion years ago, and during formation, the Earth got hit by a Mars-sized object, some object, we don't know, Mars-sized object. Then all the material from that giant blast, bigger crater than you ever seen anywhere, went out around the Earth and accreted, sort of cemented together, and became the moon. And it was thought before 15 that when the moon coalesced and got to be a single ball, okay, the ocean, the coverage of the moon was an ocean of anorthosite, a crystalline material, okay? Over the years, the moon experienced a lot of volcanism and had many impacts from many meteorites and everything, and became more solidified now. And all of the early crust was buried beneath the volcanism. And the object, one object of our mission was to see if we could find a piece of that early crust to help understand the formation of the Earth, in addition to the moon. And it's called anorthosite with a mineral plagioclase in it. So my teacher, Professor Jim Head is at Brown University. He's my teacher today, geology teacher. Lee Silver, okay, would grind into us, find me a piece of anorthosite, find this. So I figured, I got to get a good grade in this deal. I do what my professor wants me to do. But anyway, it's fun going through the mineralogy and learning these rocks. I'll tell you, I had a good time doing that. But Jim and I, and by the way, I'll mention Jim Irwin, the best partner I ever could have had on the moon, probably the only guy who could have put up with me for 3 days. Geez. But he was just a great guy, and we had a great team and a lot of fun together. So our job was to see if we could find some anorthosite. And everything on the moon is covered with lunar dust, with gray dust. Well, by golly, we did find a piece of anorthosite. A little chunk, about that big, sitting on top of a pedestal, like somebody planted it there. Covered with dust, but we both saw it at the same time and reported back to Dr. Silver. We found what we came for. That's the whole idea behind this exercise. And it turns out to be some anorthosite, and the press called it the Genesis rock, 4.2 billion years old, and it was apparently part of the original lunar crust. So we made the scientist happy, and that was the whole point.
And in the moment, if you get to see the movie, while David's picking it up, he makes reference to the fact that this rock I have in my hand has been around longer than any creature's walked Earth. I mean, that is a remarkable statement. I have to ask you about the teaching of young people. Many of us who might have been in school in the early 70s saw you on television do a Galileo experiment on the moon. And we'd never really seen an astronaut do something that either looked fun or that we could learn from. Can you tell us, obviously, the basics of the experiment, and then what caused you to try to bring those items to the moon and make that point?
Well, we felt that we should try and do something a little broader than our mission objectives. And we spent a lot of time at Cape Kennedy in the crew quarters in those days. We were in isolation 3 weeks before the launch, but we lived down there. Everything was down there. And we had a great set of crew quarters with a big conference table. And every evening after dinner, we go sit at the conference table and either invite a lecturer in, one of the scientists, or sit around and try and dream up things that would help the mission. And one of the things we thought about was, what can we do as a scientific experiment outside of the plan, right, that would be meaningful for young people, for students, right? And my Capcom, the guy who speaks to us when we're on the surface of the moon, Joe Allen, was a physicist was a PhD physicist. And one night we're sitting there, and he says, "Hey, Dave, why don't you try the hammer and the feather?" I thought, shoot, that's not a bad idea. It's pretty good because we never had enough weight anyway, so you can't take anything extra. But I had a hammer, and it's a big, heavy hammer. I'll tell you, it's a heavy dude because on the moon it only weighs 1/6 of on the Earth. So you got to have a lot of mass to break off chunks of rock. So I thought, so I take the whole. He likes this story. So I'm sitting there thinking, and we all talk about it, and then I get committed to doing this thing. I said, okay, let's see how we going to do this. Well, I got a hammer. I got to get a feather, and I got to sneak it on. So let's see. So I had an old buddy who happened to be a professor at the Air Force Academy, and I called him up and I said, "Hey, Leo," I said, "I got a problem. I need a feather." He said, "No problem. The mascot at the Air Force Academy is a falcon." So lo and behold, about 3 weeks later, I was in my office, and the secretary came in and said, "Hey, Dave, there are 2 guys out here dressed up in civilian clothes who want to see you. You know who they are?" I said, "Yes, send them in." And here come 2 sergeants in civilian clothes from the Air Force Academy, right? Clandestine. They come in, we close the door, and they hand me 2 falcon feathers. At the same time, the poor bird is squawking like hell. So, okay, I put it in the system, put it in my pocket, and by the time we got into mission, it's always press, press, press. You never have enough time to finish up. But old Jimmy says, "Hey, Dave, don't forget." I thought, oh, shoot, I better try. And here's another interesting part of the culture in this system, right? There's one flight controller in mission control who controls the motion of the TV camera. We had the first color TV camera that could be controlled from the Earth. And he was a video controller in mission control who later became a close friend of mine. And he could control the zoom and the pan on the video. So nobody knew about this feather and hammer except our Capcom, Joe Allen, of course, and the crew. And in those days, nothing leaked out. If we said no talk, no tell anybody, it didn't go anywhere. Nobody, none of the bosses knew this thing, right? So we get down to the end of the mission, and Jim says, "Hey, Dave, don't forget." So I had 2 feathers, and I thought, you know, a good scientist pays attention to the physics. What if the feather sticks to the glove due to static electricity? Didn't know that on the moon in a vacuum. Nobody tried to hold a feather on the moon. So I thought, well, I got 1 extra feather and 1 extra to do. But we're out of time. At the same time, hurry up, you guys, close it out and get going. So I ran over in front of the limb, and I heard Joe Allen say to the video controller, Ed Findell, "Hey, Ed, shift it to the right, shift it to the right." So he swings it over to the right. He gets a good framing, and he has a 3-second delay controlling this video camera. So the signals don't get to the camera and back for 3 seconds. So he has to anticipate what I'm going to do, and he doesn't know what I'm going to do. So all of a sudden, I get out there, I get the hammer and the feather, and he zooms and pans just right to get the image. And so I gave it a go. I didn't have a chance to try it. I thought, we're in a big hurry. Let's see if it works. They can erase if it doesn't work, right? So I dropped them, and by golly, they came down at exactly the same time. And people have timed it, too. Now, they look at every teeny little thing. Now, if you're going to do something, they're going to pick it apart. But it worked pretty well. And as I mentioned at the time, I guess we're going to get home okay. Anyway, that was that one. That was a fun one. We had a few fun ones, you know. It doesn't all work. In fact, my backup on every mission, Gemini VIII, Apollo 9, and Apollo 15, was Dick Gordon, a Navy test pilot, a great, great guy. He happened to live diagonally across from me, too. So we became really close pals over the years, you know. And Dick used to say, he was on Apollo 12, and I backed up Apollo 12. Dick used to say, "Davy, we had fun. We had fun, man." And we did. We had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun. Some of it hasn't been chronicled yet, I guess.
Amen to that. Can I ask you a Hollywood question? So for those of you who've seen the movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks, if you watch the credits very closely, there is only one technical advisor to that, and that's Colonel David Scott. How did that come to be? And with all of the remarkable scenes in that movie, including dumping parts out on a table, and how much of that really happened?
Oh, you mean on Apollo 13 in the real time? Pretty close to all of it. In fact, another break I had, I was living in Manhattan Beach in L.A., and Jim Lovell called me up one day. I know Jim, we're good friends. He says, "Hey, Dave, hey, they made a movie out of they made a book out of Apollo 13. What do you think about it?" And I said, "Oh, it's really great, Jim." I hadn't read it yet, but I told Jim, "You got Jim Lovell, you got a baby Jim along." So anyway, so he said, "Well, they're going to make a movie out of that, and I'm way out here in Chicago, and I can't get out there. You go see these guys, talk to them about making some sort of movie about Apollo 13. I said, "Sure, Jim, be glad to." He says, "Okay, if you don't mind, I'll give Ron Howard your telephone number, and he'll call you." I thought, Ron Howard? Whoa, baby, here we go. So 5 minutes later, the phone rings. I pick it up. I say, "Dave Scott." "Hi, Dave, this is Ron. How you doing?" "Ron Howard? Okay, fine. Tom Hanks and I would like you to come over to the studio and talk about Apollo 13. I thought, Tom Hanks? Holy cow. Well, okay, so the next day, I get suited up. Man, I get my best summer suit, coat, tie, shine my shoes. I'm going to go meet Ron Howard and Tom Hanks. So I go up to the studio and walk in this big stage, and nobody with a suit and tie on. I guarantee you, in Hollywood, only the suits who take care of the money, that's all. So I stand there like a sore thumb, and they chuckle a little bit, but they don't embarrass me. So then we get to talking about the film and about Apollo 13, and I was in mission control during Apollo 13. In fact, I was one of the first guys to hear the problem over the loudspeaker, and I spent the next week or so in MCC flying simulators. And they let me be part of their team, which was really cool. I got to be a mission controller once, and they're really great guys. So I got on to working the movie with Ron and Bill Paxton, Gary Sinise, our favorite guy, anyway, and Tom Hanks. And they are just wonderful people. You hear a lot about Hollywood, and I had heard a lot about the, champagne lunch and the martini lunches and all that sort of stuff. Boy, that group are really hard-working people. They're sincere. There's no baloney on the stage. They're all pleasant and happy, and they're just really fine people. And I got to be good friends with Tom Hanks. I helped him on Earth to the Moon series and another little one he made, Magnificent Desolation. And he's just a great guy, I tell you. No Hollywood big head at all, just a fine fella. So I really enjoyed my association with all of them. And they did a great job on Apollo 13, and they should have won an Academy Award. It was right down the line. It was true to fact, all the way. And, they really did a great job for history because they told us true story. It's got some Hollywood twist here and there, but that's what you do in Hollywood. So that was another great experience.
We've left time for just one or two more, but I'm going to quote you. If you haven't had the chance to read this book, this is called Two Sides of the Moon, co-authored by David Scott and Alexei Leonov, and I hope you'll talk a little bit in a moment about Alexei. This is America and Russia working together in what we all remember during the Cold War was the space race. And David going behind the Iron Curtain in 67 and 69 in Paris at the air show. But I want to read something to you, David, because my question is there something spiritual, we won't ask a religious question, about what you saw and what you did? I'm thinking Neil Armstrong talked about one small step for man. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell read the Bible on Christmas Eve, 1968, to hundreds of millions of people. You quoted Plutarch when you came down. I mean, and you wrote this on page 164 of your own book. Other crews who had made it up here before us had talked about how hard it was to describe the beauty of space. Now I could see what they meant. My life until then had been the military, West Point, grad school, test pilot training. I'd use scientific manuals and technical jargon. This was a totally new domain. Maybe one day, I thought, they would send a poet into space, or maybe an artist. Only they could truly express this experience, but I wanted to capture what I could. Can you talk a little bit, without talking about your feelings, of course, that concept that so many of you who are up there had this overwhelming sense, you started speaking differently. What was it like?
Well, you don't have to go into space to appreciate the beauty of nature. And you don't have to go into space to appreciate the fact that Mother Nature controls. That's why we're here. I'm a believer. I'm a sincere believer. And I was reinforced by what I got to see and by what I got to do. And especially in companionship with other people and how you work together. And we're all here on a same little spaceship. And boy, I'll tell you, it's a vast universe. It's so far out, you can hardly tell. One of the things I enjoyed on all my flights was looking at the stars. And in Florida, you get to look at the stars a lot. And there's a lot out there, and it's a lot of fun. It's an amazing place. The moon is an amazing part of nature. The rest of this country is an amazing part of nature. And it's an interesting part of explanation and description. And that's why I said a poet or an artist, because they have unique talents and unique capabilities to express a lot of things that the rest of it can't express. I'm an engineer, pilot. I'm not a poet. I'm not an artist. My colleague, Alan Bean, was an artist. He was on Apollo 12, and he used to say, I wasn't an astronaut who became an artist. I was an artist who became an astronaut. And he's done some marvelous work in his style of painting. Every artist has their own style. Al's style is unique, but it's really great. But I say that really understand from a sort of spiritual nature or inner nature the beauty of space. You have to have a person who can express the beauty of space. And so hopefully someday we can get somebody's art studio up there. And, we've had a lot of artists express space art, if you will, kind of stuff. And it's obviously very difficult for a lot of them to do, but they do it very well. Bob McCall is another. Really got to be a good friend, great artist, done a lot of stamps and things like that. But it's just a tough thing to do. What is it like on the moon? I don't know what it's like, but I know it was how I felt. It was a great adventure for me. I learned a lot. I had a lot of fun, and we actually put together this little movie I hope you all will enjoy that maybe helps you understand a little bit.
So, David, from the 1960s to the 2020s, you've lived a life that we greatly admire. We appreciate, we respect, we thank you for your service to the country. Mag, you and David have made our university much better today. Been an extraordinary time. I hope you all see the movie. Please join me in welcoming and thanking the great David R. Scott.